When we ended episode 1, investigators had arrived at a house on West Chew Avenue in Philadelphia's Olney neighborhood, but that was only the beginning. Because once authorities started looking deeper into the history surrounding this property, they weren't just examining what allegedly happened in June of 2026, they were looking backward, years backward, and names of women who had seemingly disappeared from different parts of Philadelphia began entering the conversation. Tonight, we're going to focus on those women, not the rumors, not the theories spreading across social media, the women themselves, and what investigators have actually said about the evidence they're examining. Some of these cases stretch back more than a decade, and before we're finished, we're going to get to the massive amount of digital material that investigators are now working through, because that may ultimately become one of the most important parts of this entire investigation. This is the Olney House Investigation, Episode 2. When a story like this explodes online, something happens very quickly. The house becomes famous. The investigation becomes famous. The people being investigated become famous. And sometimes the women at the center of the story become little more than names on a screen. I don't want to do that here. Amy McHale, Blair Tonzelli, and other women whose names authorities and news organizations have examined as this investigation has expanded. Their circumstances aren't identical, their timelines aren't identical, and we shouldn't assume that every woman mentioned in connection with this investigation experienced the same thing. That's especially important because this remains an active case. No court has established one grand theory explaining every disappearance. So instead of beginning with a theory, let's begin with what we actually know. And one of the earliest disappearances connected publicly to the West Chew Avenue address takes us back to 2016. Her name was Amy McHale. Amy McHale had a personal connection to this house long before police descended on it in 2026. She had previously been married to Raymond R.C. Horsch, Eugene Horsch's father. According to Amy's family, even after Amy and Raymond divorced, the two remained in contact. Then came June of 2016. Amy's mother and daughter would later tell CBS Philadelphia that on June 13th, Amy left her daughter a voicemail. In that message, Amy reportedly said she was safe. She also reportedly said she was at the West Chew Avenue house with R.C. Horsch. And then, the calls stopped. According to her family, that was the last day Amy's mother and daughter heard from her. Imagine having that voicemail, knowing where someone said they were, knowing who they said they were with, and then spending years wondering what happened after that call ended. For Amy's family, those questions didn't disappear when the years passed, and then 10 years later, police suddenly began searching that same address. This is where we need to be extremely precise. Amy's family has said the West Chew Avenue house was her last known location. That does not, by itself, establish what happened to her there, or even establish that something happened to her inside that property. And as of the publicly reported searches we've been following, investigators had not announced finding Amy's remains at the house. But you can understand why the 2026 search immediately got her family's attention. The same address was suddenly surrounded by investigators, evidence was being removed, federal agencies were involved, and the history of the property was being examined in a way Amy's family had waited years to see. There was another complication. R.C. Horsch died in 2025. So by the time this current investigation began, one of the people who may have been able to answer questions about Amy's final known movements was no longer alive. And Amy wasn't the only missing woman whose story had a connection to this address. Now, the investigation begins getting more complicated. Gabrielle Amarando's name has surfaced in the widening examination of women investigators believe may be relevant to what they're uncovering. But this is exactly where responsible storytelling matters. We're not going to take a name, appearing in an investigation and turn it into a conclusion that law enforcement hasn't established. We're also not going to describe disturbing material simply for shock value. What matters is that investigators have been examining years of information, different women, different timelines, different circumstances, and as we'll get to shortly, authorities are faced with an enormous digital archive that could potentially help them determine which connections are real and which ones aren't. Because an investigation isn't about making everything fit a theory, it's supposed to be about following evidence until you know what actually fits. Maribel Fresses is another woman whose name has emerged as authorities examine the broader collection of evidence. And again, we're going to treat her as a person, not as a shocking detail in somebody else's story. There are families behind these names. People who remember birthdays, phone calls, arguments, inside jokes, ordinary moments that never make it into a police report. That's why I'm intentionally not showing anything graphic in this series. If investigators say disturbing evidence exists, we can tell you that without displaying it. Our purpose here is to understand what authorities are investigating, not turn another person's tragedy into spectacle. And when you place these cases alongside Amy and Blair, you begin seeing why investigators have such a difficult job. The timeline stretches across years. Look at this timeline. That's what makes this case so unusual. We're not talking about events occurring over a weekend. We're talking about years. Amy's family says her last communication came in 2016. Blair Tonzelli was last seen in August 2022 and was eventually reported missing by friends in February 2023. Then in June 2026, a woman accompanying Eugene Horsch allegedly presented identification bearing Blair's name. Investigators searched the property, and suddenly old questions were being asked again. But there's another detail that's extremely important. Reporting from the Philadelphia Inquirer says Eugene Horsch was incarcerated at the time Amy McHale disappeared. He has also not been accused of a violent crime connected to the missing women. That's exactly why we cannot simply lump every name together and say one person was responsible. The timeline itself tells us this investigation is more complicated than that, and investigators now have another timeline to reconstruct, a digital one. Think about your own phone for a moment. How many pictures are on it? How many videos, messages, documents? Now imagine investigators having to examine devices accumulated over years. Every file has to be evaluated. When was it created? Where did it come from? Was it downloaded? Was it created by someone associated with the property? Was it altered? Does its metadata tell investigators anything? Does it relate to a real event? Or is it completely unrelated? That's why digital forensics can move painfully slowly. And it's especially important here because R.C. Horsch was involved in photography, filmmaking, and writing during his lifetime. Some of his creative work reportedly dealt with extremely dark fictional subject matter. That creates a huge problem for investigators. They have to distinguish fiction from evidence. Something disturbing isn't automatically evidence of an actual event. Context matters, origin matters, dates matter, and that's where Image 8 takes us. Picture sitting at one of these computers. You open a folder, then another, and every time something appears potentially significant, you can't simply jump to a conclusion. You document it, preserve it, compare it, determine who created it, determine when, look for corroborating evidence. And sometimes the most important discovery isn't the obvious thing sitting directly in front of you. It could be metadata, a timestamp, a location, a file name, or a connection to something investigators already know. That's why this case could continue changing. Information that seems meaningless today might suddenly become important when compared against something investigators discover months from now. And remember what we've already learned from this investigation. Some early assumptions have already changed. What was initially believed by sources to possibly be blood inside the house was later reported by the Inquirer not to be blood, and testing at that stage had not found Amy or Blair's DNA in the property. That's a perfect example of why we wait for testing instead of treating rumors as facts. And this is probably the image that best represents where the investigation stands. Not one dramatic piece of evidence, a mountain of information. That's what investigators are facing. Some evidence may ultimately prove important, some may lead nowhere, some may answer questions investigators weren't originally asking, and some may have perfectly ordinary explanations. Authorities have also gone beyond digital evidence. In July, investigators excavated pipes around the West Chew Avenue property. Philadelphia police, the FBI, and the Philadelphia Water Department participated, and sections of pipe were removed for forensic examination. Law enforcement sources later told CBS Philadelphia that investigators were exploring whether there was evidence associated with a chemical process, sometimes called water cremation. But here's the sentence that matters. Exploring a possibility does not establish that it occurred. CBS reported that no human remains had been located during those searches. And that's where we have to leave the physical evidence until investigators tell us more. So after 2 episodes, what do we actually know? We know Eugene Horsch's June 19th encounter with law enforcement opened the door to this investigation. We know identification bearing Blair Tonzelli's name became a critical part of that encounter. We know Blair had disappeared years earlier, and friends had reported her missing. We know Amy McHale's family says her last known communication placed her at the West Chew Avenue property with R.C. Horsch in June 2016. We know investigators searched the house and removed an extraordinary variety of evidence. We know they eventually went underground and removed sections of pipe for forensic examination. And we know investigators still have questions. But here's what we don't know. We don't know what happened to every woman whose name has surfaced. We don't know whether every connection investigators are examining will ultimately prove meaningful. And we absolutely do not have enough verified information to declare Eugene Horsch or his late father responsible for every disappearance connected publicly to this story. That's why this series is going to continue following the evidence rather than the internet rumors, because there is another part of this investigation we haven't really explored yet. Raymond R.C. Horsch, his background, his relationship with Amy, his photography and filmmaking, his writings, and the difficult question investigators face when someone's fictional work contains dark themes. Where does fiction end and evidence begin? That's where we're going in episode 3. If you watched episode 1, you now know how investigators arrived at West Chew Avenue. And after episode 2, you know why the women connected to this investigation and the evidence being examined have raised so many unanswered questions. But we're not finished. Episode 3 will focus on R.C. Horsch. We're going to look at what is publicly documented about his past, his creative work, and his connections to people involved in this developing investigation. And we're going to separate the material that can actually be verified from the rumors circulating online. If you're following this case with us, subscribe to Halloween Night Vibe and add the Olney House Investigation playlist to your watch list. And if new verified information comes out before episode 3, we'll update the story, because this investigation is still developing and there are still a lot of unanswered questions.